The idea for the Consolidated B-24 Liberator came in the late 1930s when the Army Air Corps realized the need for a long-range heavy bomber that would not only be a counterpart to the older B-17, but would surpass it in performance. Flying faster with a wider range and with more bombs to deliver to the target, many thought that the designers of the B-24 had succeeded in their quest to make a better bomber. And on August 1st, 1943, in one of the most important Allied air attacks of the war, the B-24 would get the chance to prove itself in the most difficult of conditions. 176 consolidated B-24 Liberators carrying over 1,000 American aviators were to strike the oil refineries around Ploesti.
It was an extremely tough target. There was a high concentration of anti-aircraft, and both the 88 and 105 millimeters. They had a large concentration of German aircraft, and I think they also had Romanian Air Force aircraft also. Oh yeah, we heard a lot about it during training, and we were expecting to fly Ploesti when we got there.
These targets supplied Hitler's war machine with almost 60% of its oil products. If Ploesti could be destroyed, the German army could be stopped in its tracks and the Luftwaffe's fighters starved for fuel. To General Louis Brereton, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Air Forces and the man who ordered the attack, 50% losses would be a small price to pay if such success could be gained. Brereton insisted that the bombers go in on the deck and bomb from 250 feet. The group commanders, as well as the commander of the 9th Air Force, protested the order in writing. Brereton refused to relent. The mission, he felt, was too important. Ploesti had to be destroyed. For 2,400 miles, the bombers hugged the earth en route to targets.
Each group had one of the refineries and their targets. They were to stay at low level all the way across the Mediterranean, to stay out of radar contact, then cross over Yugoslavia into Romania.
The mission began to unravel as soon as the Liberators took off from their Benghazi area airfields. Nearby, watching the American planes get aloft and head out northward, were 3 German spies. They would not be caught until April of 1944, so on this day, their fervent warnings to German headquarters on Crete would doom hundreds of American airmen. The mission had been compromised. The Germans knew the Liberators were coming, and they'd be waiting. Over the Mediterranean Sea, things got worse. In the lead group, the 376th, a B-24 flown by Captain Glenn Flavelle suddenly pitched up and out of formation. Wingo Wango, the name of the B-24, stalled, then fell into the sea with a tremendous explosion. Flavelle's wingman disobeyed standing orders and turned back to the crash site, hoping to drop a rubber life raft to any survivors. They found none, and when the B-24 swung back round on course, the 376th was too far ahead to catch. Reluctantly, they turned for Africa, carrying with them the deputy lead navigator for the entire mission. That would not have been a critical error had not the mission's lead navigator gone down with Flavelle's Wingo Wango. As it was, the 2 most experienced navigators who had been specially trained for this complicated attack were now out of the equation. Colonel Keith Compton, the 376th Group's commander, now took over navigating the raiders to Ploesti. Over Yugoslavia, Compton's pilots ran into heavy cloud cover as they neared a mountain range. As they climbed through the clouds to get over the peaks below, the B-24s briefly reached 16,000 feet. A nearby German radar set detected the bombers. Axis fighters from all over the Balkans were scrambled to stop the onrushing Liberators. Passing the mountains, Compton dove his group back down on the deck. As they reformed just above the ground, the 376th was alone. Weather had scattered the other groups. The strike would go in piecemeal. The plan had called for the bombers to make their attack from the north, swinging around Ploesti before turning south to come in from the most unexpected direction. Compton, however, made a serious navigational error. His crew mistook the initial point and turned too early, hurtling the 376th not at Ploesti but at Bucharest. 3 of the other 4 groups also suffered some sort of navigational lapse. The remaining group, Colonel John Killer Kane's 98th, was the only one to fly the assigned route and get to Ploesti on time. Rather than one hammer blow, the raiders dribbled into Ploesti from different directions. From 250 feet, the B-24s that reached their oil refinery targets were greeted by thousands of anti-aircraft bursts, scores of tracers from machine guns emplaced near their targets, and by 320 German, Romanian, and Bulgarian fighters. In the end, it was pure carnage. The Liberators dumped their 500 and 1,000-pound bombs on the vulnerable refineries. When they detonated, they blew huge chunks of debris hundreds of feet into the air. Onrushing Liberators had to dodge the flying cascade of metal as their bombardiers fought desperately to pick out a good spot to toggle their bombs. One B-24 was nearly swatted out of the sky by the top of one of the enormous oil storage tanks that had been blown off by a direct hit. Other B-24s followed on the heels of the first wave. All around them, flames and smoke were belching from blazing oil tanks and lines. Through the smoke, the Liberators emerged, sweeping around the 210-foot smokestacks as anti-aircraft fire savaged their ranks. Individually, they toggled their bombs, then dove back down to ground level and sped frantically for home. The Germans had a flak train at Ploesti, and the canny crew raced along the tracks, almost pacing the bombers.
The flak trains were going around 50, 60 miles an hour as the planes came in at 150, 160, 180, depending. And they were just paralleling. And as they came down the valley, the flak guns were just hitting them, and they became some pretty sharp targets for the flak gunners.
The AA gunners had point-blank targets that required little lead. They couldn't miss. Bomber after bomber brewed up into brilliant incandescent explosions, shedding wings, engines, and tails as they billowed into the ground. Several times, Liberators were caught in the flames flaring up from the damaged refineries below. Colonel John Kane's B-24 went right through one such funnel of fire.
When the 98th came in, Kane turned at the proper place, went to his proper target, but he found his target was already in flames. And instead of aborting it, he said, we're going to go on, stay on our course and just go on and go according to plan. So he brought his planes right in through the smoke and through the fire. Bombs were exploding, planes were going through. Out of the 98, he lost 22 aircraft. So that's out of 40, 50 planes, he lost 22 alone.
Last into Ploesti came the 389th Bomb Group. Smoke and fire almost totally obscured their targets, but still they clung to their mission. Wrote Captain Philip Ardrey, a squadron leader in the 389th, Already the flames were leaping higher than the level of our approach, and there were intermittent explosions lighting up the black pall. A gauntlet of tracers and cannon fire of all types made me despair of ever covering those last few hundred yards. Ardrey's wingman, Lieutenant Hughes, was hit in the left wing. From a gaping hole, fuel began gushing out. An instant later, the torrent caught fire and a tongue of flame blasted back from the wing and totally engulfed the fuselage and tail. Hughes held his Liberator on course. Soon the entire left wing was ablaze. The B-24 had only seconds to live, but Hughes' bombardier released their bombs, scoring direct hits on the refinery. The bomber came off target and Hughes turned for a nearby river, hoping to save his crew. But the plane began sagging toward the ground, and as they came to the river, Hughes was forced to try to climb over a bridge. The Liberator had no life left, and the maneuver caused it to pitch over and cartwheel across the river's muddy bank. With the 389th's attack complete, all of the B-24s were now racing for home, but they would not escape unharmed. Hundreds of German interceptors waded into them, and the exhausted gunners fought with all the intensity of trapped animals. It was not enough. More and more B-24s smacked into the Balkans countryside, leaving a trail of burning wreckage from Ploesti all the way through Yugoslavia. "73 B-24s went down on this Ploesti raid, 50 alone over enemy territory. Another 55 were damaged. Over 500 American airmen were killed or wounded. About another 100 were captured. 5 men, including Hughes and Kane, received the Medal of Honor.
This raid over Ploesti really demonstrated the courage and the dedication that the American airmen involved in the mission possessed. And that did not go unrecognized by the high command in the Mediterranean. And in the end, there were 5 airmen on that mission who were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is America's highest award for bravery. And there has been no mission since, and there was no mission before, that garnered so many Medal of Honor winners. It really stands as a testament to not only the bravery of the crews, but also to the difficulties and the harrowing experience of what it was like in the inferno over Ploesti.
General Brereton claimed 60% of Ploesti's production capability had been destroyed. In reality, while the destruction the raid caused had been heavy, Ploesti's refineries had not been operating at full capacity at the time of the raid. The Germans and Romanians mitigated the damage by bringing online previously unused sections of their facilities. Ploesti would go on pumping oil into the heart of the German war machine. Never again would the B-24s go in on the deck. For the next 2 years, Ploesti would be pounded time and again by the 15th Air Force's massive force of Liberators. By the time the Russians captured the target, little was left but scorched and twisted metal. Far from one lightning stroke, it took scores of missions, 360 lost B-24s, and over a year to finish off Ploesti. In the meantime, to the airmen forced to attack it, the name Ploesti would be etched in their nightmares for the rest of their lives.
They knew that Ploesti was one of the most heavily defended targets in the world, not just in Europe, but in the world, with 128 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on rails, plus the 88s, plus the light flak, the medium flak, if anybody came back at low altitude again. It was an inferno, it was a cauldron, and we lost hundreds of bombers over Ploesti, lots and lots of men. And so to the crews who flew those missions, it was one of the roughest things they probably experienced in their lives.
The plane that the men rode into the Inferno over Ploesti that day in 1944 stemmed from a late 1930s call by the U.S. Army Air Corps for another heavy bomber that could complement the B-17. Consolidated's Model 32 won the design competition, and on December 29, 1939, the first prototype took flight. Dubbed the XB-24, the plane immediately impressed the Army Air Corps. Fast, capable of carrying more bombs than the B-17 over a longer range, the new bomber had the striking power that the Army coveted.
A lot of pilots didn't like the B-24s, but I loved it. I just thought the B-24Ds and Es were just a real good airplane. You had to fly them. It wasn't like a 17. A 17, you know, was a floater. It was like a C-47 or such. It had a big wing, and the B-24 had what they called a Davis airfoil, which was a narrow wing. That you had to have more speed for takeoff and landings, while the 17 landed at a lower speed and so forth. And the B-24 carried more bombs than the B-17 and was faster than the 17. But the B-24 was built during the war for the purpose, like the Liberty ships. They were just for the battle, and after the battle was over, they got rid of all the B-24s. But I liked the B-24. I felt comfortable in it.
Indeed, the plane attracted so much notice that by 1940, both the British and French had placed large orders for it. Called the LB-30 in RAF service, the bomber initially served with Coastal Command, where it hunted German U-boats in the Atlantic. In 1942, the first B-24D variants arrived to join operational U.S. AAF bomb groups. With a max speed of 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, the Liberator was some 20 to 30 miles per hour faster than the older B-17. Its four Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines produced a total of 4,800 horsepower. 10 50 caliber machine guns protected it from enemy interceptors, while its mammoth bomb bays could hold up to 12,500 pounds of ordnance. At first glance, the B-24 appeared to be the ultimate strategic bomber, one with which the Army Air Force could crush Nazi Germany's industrial base. For all its assets, the B-24 had a number of very serious flaws that made it far less beloved by its crews than the B-17. Most serious, the Liberator could not take nearly the beating that the Flying Fortress could.
It seemed to me that about half of our missions we had malfunctions of one type or another, either caused by the combat or sometimes just happened. Get halfway to the target and one of the engines would go completely out. Oil would spurt out. No oil. Have to feather that engine and then turn around and come back rather than continue. So it was a problem, major problem, and they did everything they could to keep them going, but as I said before, they lost half of the planes that we had by the end of the war, one half. Incredible.
While the B-24 wasn't exactly fragile, it certainly was not in the same league with the rugged, tough machine that Boeing produced. All too often, Liberator missions turned into tragic tales of death and destruction at the hands of enemy fighters. B-24 pilot Bill Foster recalls just such a mission over occupied Europe.
We lost an engine, and there were fighters around, but they weren't really attacking our squadron. But I don't know whether a stray bullet, maybe just a hose flew off or what, but we lost our oil pressure on one engine. And so we feathered the engine, and we just couldn't keep up. We fell back, and we were the last one with a photographer on board. Then we lost another engine, caught on fire, and the fighters were attacking. That's when they really came in from all sides. Then they had this ME-110, a twin-engine fighter with the rockets. I'd never seen a rocket or heard of one, but we could see them going by us, and they were the ones that really did all the damage. They hit our waist and killed 2 or 3 fellows in the back. They shot all our engines off, or they quit, and all of a sudden my controls, my rudder controls just went out. I had no control of that at all, and same way with the ailerons. So I yelled, "Let's go." We had to go up through the hatch, and we're lucky our airplane had that top hatch because they all didn't. It was only 2 foot square about, and that's where we went up, all of us on the flight deck. And just as I was standing there ready to go up, I see Pete, my navigator, coming up from the bomb bay, and I got up on top and helped him up, and we were the last 2 out of the airplane. My intention was to walk all the way back the airplane on top of that fuselage and jump off the tail. But just as I started out, the plane lurched, and I fell down on the right wing and rolled off through the flames. The whole trailing edge of the right wing was on fire. And I rolled off through that, and I must have passed out because I don't remember pulling the chute. But I woke up, and I was being lifted up in the air by the chute opening. And the airplane was not too far off, and I saw it crash just, probably a city block from where we landed. One fella, early in the mission, when we were first attacked, he had his foot blown off. And we issued morphine to him, or I had to give that to him. And we thought that he had been, when we counted the chutes, we thought he had been blown out, but we found out later that they threw him out, and he was alive when he went out, but he landed in a tree and bled to death. The tail gunner was killed in the turret. The ball turret down below, he was killed just getting out of his turret. I don't know how he knew, but the photographer told me that he took a rocket right in midsection. The worst one was the nose gunner, who he had his turret over to one side. And it was shot out. The controls were shot out. The bombardier tried to wind him back in mechanically, and he couldn't do it. So he died screaming. He was in the airplane when I left.
Besides being less than durable, the B-24 with its narrow wing tended to wallow above 20,000 feet. This made it a mediocre bombing platform and made tight defensive formations above that altitude impossible to fly.
Controls are very mushy on a B-24, extremely mushy. That means when you're flying in tight formation, you're constantly moving throttles and the rudders and the ailerons all the time, just continually moving them. It was hard work. After we worked 15 minutes apiece, the pilot, 2 pilots, and after 15 minutes, you're ready for a rest.
Our best fighter cover, this isn't a fact, but it's the way we felt, was B-24s. They kind of flew this way. I was tough for them to fly formation. So if the fighters picked on anyone, they'd go after them.
It wasn't as stable as the B-17, so the B-24 guys couldn't fly as tight formation as the B-17s. And so the Germans would see the looser formations flown by the B-24 groups, and they would go in and wade into them, launch their attacks at the ones who looked like they were straggling a little bit. So tight formations had to be maintained even until the end of the war, otherwise you were a target.
To help offset the B-24's inability to fly tight formations, Consolidated equipped the J model with a nose turret that sported a pair of .50 caliber machine guns. While the additional firepower helped, that cut the Liberator's speed down to 278 miles per hour and reduced its radius of action to around 1,000 miles. The B-24J was also a foot longer than the D model, measuring 76 feet from nose to tail. Thanks to the new nose turret, its empty weight had jumped from 32,000 pounds to almost 40,000 pounds. The B-24 also turned out to be hard to fly. Small pilots usually could not handle the Liberator, as the rudder controls were so heavy and taxing that they required a bigger man with strong lower back and leg muscles. At times, it took both the pilot and co-pilot working together to operate the rudders effectively.
Flying formation, it was real heavy on the rudders. We all got what they call B-24 knees, especially at altitude. And I had a pretty severe case of that, but it didn't last.
Never loved like the B-17, the Liberator would nonetheless provide yeoman service in the U.S. Army Air Force. Never flashy, but always capable of getting the job done, the B-24 equipped the entire 3rd Air Division within the 8th Air Force. By mid-1944, the 15th Air Force in Europe flew B-24s almost exclusively. In the South Pacific, the B-17 initially served as the mainstay of the heavy bomb groups. By mid-1943, however, the B-17s were giving way to the longer-legged B-24s. Eventually, the Liberator entirely replaced the Flying Fortress in the Pacific. By war's end, the B-24 had been produced in greater numbers than any other American aircraft. No fewer than 18,482 Liberators rolled off of assembly lines throughout the United States, including the famous River Rouge plant in the Midwest. Both the Army Air Force and the Navy used the B-24 in a variety of roles, a fact which made it more versatile, if not more respected, than the B-17. Liberators were employed as high and low altitude bombers, night intruders, skip bombers, transport aircraft, and for long-range maritime patrol missions. Few aircraft in American history have been adapted for as many uses as the B-24. Its very versatility made it one of the great designs of World War II. The B-24 first saw action for the Army Air Forces with a secret unit called the Halverson Project, number 63. Nicknamed HALPRO, this small group of 23 Liberators and 231 men left Florida in May of 1942 with orders to bomb Tokyo. Led by the loud and abrasive Colonel Harry "Hurry-Up" Halverson, the detachment flew from Florida down to Brazil, crossed the Atlantic, and then passed through the interior of equatorial Africa. Turning north, HALPRO's free spirit pilots landed at Khartoum, Sudan, where the British halted them. German raids were hitting other airfields along the chain of strips HALPRO planned to use to get to China, where they had orders to operate from a series of primitive fighter bases in the Zhejiang province.
The original mission, my understanding is, was to go to Khartoum. Then from Khartoum, they were going to go to Shenzhen, China. And then they were going to bomb Tokyo, or Japan, from Shenzhen, China. But then Shenzhen was overrun by the Japanese. So that's what killed the Halverson project. But the original group was to go by way of Egypt over to Shenzhen, China, then from there bomb Japan.
All of a sudden, HALPRO's entire purpose had been rendered moot. They were orphaned in the middle of nowhere with no mission and no orders. Halverson's intrepid little band ended up joining the British Desert Air Force in Egypt. From there, his remaining B-24s began flying tactical support missions for the 8th Army as it battled Rommel around Tobruk.
We didn't have any command over there at all. We didn't have an Air Force command like 9th or 8th or anything like that. We were just a group. And the British were having problems with Rommel. Rommel was knocking at the doors of Cairo, and that's when the British asked for the B-24's support in bombing Rommel's supply lines and his ships bringing supplies in. So we took our orders, we got targets and orders from the British, or at least Kane did, and we were assigned missions.
On one mission, Halverson's B-24s actually attacked an Italian surface task force composed of cruisers and battleships.
Malta was an ideal post out there that could pick up the convoys coming from Italy and Germany. Would have to bypass off the coast of Malta, and when the information on convoys came through, it was passed on to our bomber command or group, and we were told what to look for and where to find them or anticipate finding them. So we'd go out after the ships in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's not easy to hit a maneuvering ship, because by the time you drop your bomb and that ship goes and changes course to a different direction, your bomb isn't going to hit. But we did get ships. We did damage them or cripple them. And then the British submarines in the area would finish them off if possible.
Then in June of 1942, the USAAF commander Hap Arnold came up with a new and dangerous secret mission for Halpro. Instead of flying on to join the fight against the Japanese or staying in Egypt where they would continue to fight Rommel, Arnold ordered Colonel Halverson to attack Ploesti. Originally, Halpro's pilots were supposed to fly from Egypt, skirt Turkish waters, then turn north to fly up through the Balkans to strike the oil fields, then head back south. As the navigators worked the course out, they discovered that they probably wouldn't have enough fuel to get home. Instead, the American officers who arrived to brief them told the crews to land in Iraq. That shortened the flight to about 2,600 miles, but still the B-24s could not possibly fly that far with the 3,600-pound bomb load they had been ordered to carry.
Hurry Up Halverson was not the kind of guy who was going to risk the lives of his men to satisfy some political decision or political need on the part of the Allies. So just before this mission was flown, he walked in to the briefing room, saw his crews, and looked at them and said, "All right," pointed at a map, said, "This is the most direct route," and he pointed across Turkey. "We're going to use it." And so, oh, and by the way, flying at low altitude, that's not going to happen either. So they went up to their normal bombing altitude. They crossed Turkey illegally. They bombed Ploesti and came back across Turkey illegally. But they did so and got back. The ones that got back had actually enough fuel to get back. There were some that got interned in Turkey and one that ended up in Iraq. But for the most part, that decision probably saved many lives on that mission. Otherwise, had they gone the route that they had been originally ordered to go and at the altitude, they probably would have been shot down to the last plane or run out of gas on the way home.
To the pilot's relief, Halverson knew that any other way into Ploesti would guarantee a suicide mission. On June 11, 1942, the mission began. Halpro's raid on Ploesti was the first American raid on the European continent, and it was the first raid on the critical oil fields that would later absorb so many American bombs. 12 B-24s made it over Romania, where one bombed ships in a Black Sea harbor and the others hit the oil refineries around Ploesti, then turned for home. Halpro's first Ploesti mission never received much publicity, and the low-altitude strike a year later, on August 1st, 1943, soon eclipsed the single pinprick raid. Halverson himself landed in hot water for taking his men over neutral Turkey. He then ended up destroying his career when he began arguing with his British superiors in Egypt.
After that first Ploesti mission, Halverson locked horns numerous times with his British superiors, who complained to Washington enough so that he eventually got recalled, and that destroyed his military career. He came home kind of in ignominy and ended up retiring from the service as a colonel and didn't see any further action in World War II. It's kind of a tragic end to a guy who was really loved by his airmen.
Halpro had ceased to exist, but in its short combat career it had proved the value of the B-24. A year later, hundreds of B-24s were operational from the North African desert to East Anglia to the frozen Aleutian Islands through to the jungles of New Guinea. On every front where the Army Air Force saw action during World War II, the B-24 served as a key player in the heavy bomber forces. In the Pacific, the long-range Liberators were used by Kenny's 5th Air Force as both low and high-level bombers. One B-24 group, the 380th, flew out of Darwin, Australia for much of the war, where they struck repeatedly at the Japanese occupation forces of the Dutch East Indies. The 380th grew experienced at low-altitude night anti-shipping missions, as well as night intruder missions against ground targets. Later, the B-24s from the 380th would strike at another key oil installation, Balikpapan. Sometimes called the Ploesti of the East, the refineries around Balikpapan supplied Japan with most of its oil and aviation gas. Initially, the 380th Bomb Group went after Balikpapan by itself, in daylight and at night. Unescorted, its B-24s suffered heavy losses.
In 1944, General Kenny, the commander of Far East Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, felt that if his heavy bombers could knock out Balikpapan, Borneo, and the oil fields and the refineries around that city, that they could force the Japanese to surrender. Balikpapan was seen sort of as the Ploesti of the East, as the big holy grail target for the Southwest Pacific Air Forces. And that was really wishful thinking. The Japanese weren't going to surrender because they didn't have an oil refinery in Borneo. With the arrival of the 13th Air Force and their B-24s, he actually had enough bomb groups to actually make a sustained heavy series of strikes on Balikpapan, and he took advantage of that opportunity. And he personally visited the bomb groups to try to buck up morale and get those guys behind this operation.
In the early days of October, the bombers flew the 1,200 miles to the target and back alone. In the process, Japanese interceptors knocked down many of the raiders. Kenny's B-24 groups couldn't withstand such losses. Short on crews and with few replacements in sight, he had to figure out a way to protect his B-24s, or he wouldn't have enough bombers to cover the coming invasion of the Philippines. Fortunately, his 5th Air Force fighter groups found a way to get their P-47s and P-38s from Morotai to Balikpapan and back. Starting October 11, 1944, the bombers went to the refineries covered by swarms of little friends. The Japanese rose to greet the attackers and were massacred by the P-38s and 47s. Balikpapan was hit hard, though the refineries were not totally knocked out. The Balikpapan raids were the longest missions of the war in the Pacific for the fighters that accompanied the B-24s. Some of the fighter pilots were airborne for over 8 hours and landed with just a few drops of fuel remaining in their tanks.
The problem was the target was not really worthwhile. The Japanese didn't have the shipping left to haul all the oil up to Japan, so whether or not their production facility there was destroyed was really immaterial. The reality was they couldn't get the oil that was even being produced at that point to Japan. There just weren't the tankers left because the American submarine campaign had just ravaged Japan's sea lanes.
While Kenny's B-24s were pounding Balikpapan, over in England, the Liberators of the 3rd Air Division, 8th Air Force, were being used to hit targets deep in Germany. Early on, operational experience showed that B-17s and 24s could not really operate together as they had very different cruise speeds. As a result, the 8th's B-24s were separated into their own air division and were frequently used on feints and diversionary attacks. This secondary role grated on the Liberator crews, who knew their aircraft could strike targets anywhere in Europe. Finally, the 8th began sending the 3rd Air Division on more meaningful missions, always covered by hundreds of escort fighters. The B-24s were still more vulnerable than the B-17 and needed as much protection as possible. 8th Air Force Liberators spent 1944 and 45 hitting cities and factories deep in Germany, Poland, and Austria. At times, only the 8th's P-51 Mustangs had the range to follow the B-24s to their distant targets and back. Across Europe, losses continued to be heavy. German fighters were becoming less of a threat, but large concentrations of flak guns began to take their toll.
The plane that had been on our right, as they went over the target, they got a direct hit right in the waist. And when the flak exploded, or whatever it was, well, it had been flak, exploded inside the plane. And it just looked like a little ruffle, like kind of bulged out, you know, all the way around the plane. And at that mission, I was a fly in the waist, and he was just right there, you know, where I could look right out there and see him. And pretty soon, where that expanded out, the plane broke in two, and the engine just tilted up and went straight into the ground, and the tailpiece went up over the plane behind them, and then ducked down and went down underneath the plane, the next plane. It just flipped. Lucky, not for them, but for the guy behind, the two planes behind him, they were real fortunate.
Not only did the air crews have to worry about flak and fighters, but they also needed to be aware of more insidious, less common ploys the Germans used to try to bring down the Allied bombers.
One time that there was a B-24 come in and tried to join up with us, tried to get into our formation, you know. They had that top turret just going round and around there, trying to persuade us that they could come in, you know, and join up with us. But we wouldn't let them, because we didn't know. Because they had captured some of the planes and were flying them themselves. And so the engineer then put off a flare, and they couldn't answer the code with the flares, and so they backed off, and that was the last I seen of them. That was quite prevalent, you know. They'd warned us about this, that don't let a plane in, that unless you're absolutely sure, and that was why the flares were supposed to acknowledge, you know, that was one of our group.
If a captured plane were able to get into a tight formation of B-24s, it would have the potential to do substantial damage. In Italy, the 15th Air Force, by 1944, had been fighting a war of its own against the soft underbelly of the Third Reich. The 15th's B-24s routinely hit targets in northern Italy, Austria, Eastern Europe, and of course, Ploesti. In 1944, however, with the arrival of the P-51D, these Mediterranean-based Liberators were able to strike Berlin from the south, and have a protective fighter escort through the entire mission. The Berlin raids were fiercely contested affairs, and the 15th B-24 crews were hit by everything the Luftwaffe had left, including the Me-262 jet fighter. Again, losses were heavy, but the 15th kept up the pressure, providing, along with the 8th Air Force, a constant 1-2 punch against the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the B-24 groups in Europe took part in several highly unusual missions. During the Allied effort to cross the Rhine, the largest airborne assault of World War II was made by American and British paratroop and glider units. Fighting alone and isolated on the eastern side of the Rhine, these men quickly ran low on supplies. A massive effort was made to get food, ammunition, and medicine to the brave paratroops, but the number of transport planes proved insufficient for the task. Liberator units all over East Anglia were then loaded with supplies and flown over the Rhine area battlefields at under 1,000 feet, where they dropped their precious cargoes to the desperate men below. The Liberators' cavernous bomb bay turned out to be ideal for such missions, but flying the huge B-24 at such low altitude in the face of light and medium anti-aircraft guns could be exceedingly dangerous.
The American paratroops and glider forces really took a beating from German anti-aircraft fire. And when their resupply B-24s came in, they got hit by the same AA fire. And many B-24s were shot up going in that low. They were a huge target. They were badly shot up dropping supplies to the paratroops. And they lost a dozen B-24s with many more damaged on this mainly mission of mercy, something that the B-24 had never been designed to do, really. And it was one that inspired some bitterness among some of the crews.
As the war dragged into its final weeks, the Liberator played one last role, one in which it would be long remembered by suffering Dutch civilians. Allied air planners received word in the spring of 1945 that Holland was starving. Cut off from Germany, the Nazi-held sections of the Netherlands had run out of food and fuel. The entire civilian population was in jeopardy of starving to death. The 8th Air Force came to the rescue. The B-17 and B-24 groups swarmed low over Holland, dropping canned food, powdered milk, and sea rations by the ton on the grateful population. As the war ended, the 3rd Air Division's B-24s continued to fly these missions of mercy. Through their efforts, thousands of Dutch lives were saved. For the men who flew these supply runs, they were the most rewarding missions of the war, the ones they remember with the most pride.
They converted all our bombers. Every bomber that took part in the raid was converted. We put wooden platforms in the bomb bays, hinged them on one side on the bomb racks, and fixed it so the bombardier could, when he dropped, toggle the bombs. Instead of bombs, the doors came open, these wooden doors, and what we had stacked on the doors would fall out. The Dutch civilians had marked the fields where they wanted us to drop. They put a white cross. But I did hit the white cross one time. You know, it's kind of interesting because sometimes I can remember my commanding officer, his airplane, they were having trouble. The doors open, but the boxes didn't fall out. So they also furnished a long stick in the airplane so that the person, actually was a flight engineer, could take the stick and poke at things. So I can remember watching the commanding officer's airplane going around and one box at a time falling out. I could watch, I remember one hitting a cow. There's a cow down there and the cow just turned over. I watched a couple go through the roofs of houses. That was home delivery. Just went right through the roof. But I tell you, the Dutch civilians really appreciated what I do. I think that to them now it's like a holiday. that they really celebrate the fact that we saved their lives.
With the end of the war, the B-24 disappeared from American service with surprising speed. Liberators in Europe were lined up by the hundreds in fields across England and Germany where they were summarily scrapped. The few that returned to the United States were quickly mothballed in aircraft boneyards in Arizona and Southern California. By late 1946, hardly a B-24 remained in flying condition. While the B-24 Liberator outnumbered all other American heavy bombers of World War II, its key role in the air campaigns against Germany and Japan has been eclipsed by the more popular and beloved Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Never a plane to generate much passion with its crews, the B-24 nonetheless formed the backbone of the 15th, 13th, 5th, and 7th Air Forces and flew on some of the most important missions of the war. Liberators dropped more bombs than any other American heavy bomber during the war, doing so while taking heavy losses from flak and fighters. Though it never became a true legend in aviation history as did the B-17 and the B-29, the Liberators served as the Army Air Force's most versatile workhorse. Said one Liberator pilot, "It was good enough to get the job done."